This video contains story spoilers for both the Plague Tale games and both the Last of Us games. If you're planning to play them and haven't yet, I highly recommend that you do so before watching this video. You have been warned.
Yes, because this world hurts. And it keeps hurting. And you want to hurt it back. But it's a fight you cannot win, Amicia.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
Finger!
I'm Amicia de Rune!
I'm not fucking moving.
The narrative of A Plague Tale Requiem sees Amicia de Rune lose herself to wrath and violence in a way that parallels Ellie Williams' bloody arc in The Last of Us Part 2. We can see both characters in these games struggle to retain a sense of self as their mission overtakes them, continually exacting a heavier toll in how much they must kill and the effect that has on both their minds and their personal relationships. But the tolls these characters pay are in service of opposing purposes. The Last of Us Part 2 asks what it takes to pull ourselves back from a path of self-destruction, whilst The Plague Tale Requiem weighs up the sacrifices necessary to hold on to hope and the cost of doing the right thing. The former weighs avenging what was lost against fighting for what we still have or might yet gain, whilst the latter pits those we love against the fate of the entire world. Amicia's dilemma in Requiem also mirrors Joel Miller's in The Last of Us Part 1, both characters asked to lose a child they have grown to love to end a plague. The decision for both is also contextualized by past loss, and yet who they are, the course of their journey in the game, and the child's agency, or lack thereof, in each case means they make opposing decisions in nearly opposing contexts. There's a lot more to be said about these points, so in this video, I'm going to compare the two narratives in order to explore their themes and what the parallels and divergences in the story have to say about their subject matter. Both games come on the back of a critically acclaimed first entry which told the story of a protector escorting a young child in the midst of an outbreak, growing closer as they face off both human enemies and monstrous enemies, using both stealth and combat. The child being connected to the outbreak and potentially the answer to it, with an armed faction seeking to use that potential for their own ends. Despite this, it would be inaccurate to say that The Last of Us and A Plague Tale Innocence tell the same story. They set themselves apart very distinctly, and these differences tell us much about the worlds the stories inhabit, aside from the obvious point of one being in modern America and the other medieval France. Joel is a hardened survivor, his humanity broken by the 20 years that we miss between the death of his daughter and his meeting Ellie. Amicia is just beginning that journey when she takes Hugo into her care, and must learn what she must become to stay alive, even as she tries to meet the needs of a brother she hardly knows. Whereas Joel has long suppressed his feelings, having to relearn fatherhood to become more than just a protector for Ellie, Amicia finds herself having to suppress the self that is scared, impatient or childish, to be not merely Hugo's sister, but a stand-in for the parents they have both lost. And whereas Ellie thinks herself strong, shaped by the past experiences we saw in the American Dreams comic and the Left Behind DLC, travelling with Joel makes her realise just how innocent she really is, and what she must overcome to face the world beyond the walls of the quarantine zone. Even though Amicia's role in Innocence is analogous to Joel's in The Last of Us, she's closer to Ellie in terms of the growth she goes through, except without her own Joel to lean on when it goes wrong. Hugo, by contrast, is almost too innocent for the world he's been thrown into. Unlike Ellie, he is completely helpless, frustratingly naive to the dangers, with exactly the view of the world you would expect from a 5-year-old raised in isolation by his mother. Once he gains his powers, and necessity demands he kill, he's under-equipped for the psychological toll they will take, at once horrified by what he can do, as he has been by what others are willing to do, but with a young child's volatility also making him careless and cavalier. This is something that becomes far more explicit in Requiem. Moving beyond the main characters, one of the driving elements of both games is that the outbreak isn't the only or even the primary threat to the protagonists. Both expose the ugly side of humanity, and leave the lead characters only able to trust a small minority of individuals. In The Last of Us, this manifests as the human species on the whole being savage and brutal at the core. We see this in the fact that there's no singular group trying to kill Joel and Ellie, but rather almost everyone they run across. From the military upholding the strict martial law of Boston, through the hunters of Pittsburgh, to the Fireflies who turn on Joel as soon as he opposes their intentions, every faction of humanity is at least a potential threat. Even allies such as Tess and Bill are as quick to hostility, and you're glad to be on their right side. We don't see hope in the future of humanity in The Last of Us until Part 2, through the independent community of Jackson, and then it serves primarily as a sharp contrast to what Ellie faces in Seattle and later Santa Barbara. In A Plague Tale, though there are unaffiliated humans who act hostile to Amicia and Hugo, this is primarily driven by fear and a lack of understanding. Even then, in that first encounter in the village they reach after losing their estate, the siblings come across Clervy as a kindly ally. We also see other villagers grumbling about the actions of their leader, and later even that leader himself begging for death when facing Amicia, driven mad by loss. Beyond this, the human antagonists are either from the main enemy faction, the Inquisition, or soldiers of the 100 Years' War between England and France. Even then, we come across a sympathetic soldier who lets us pass if we opt to save him, and other signs that rather than dealing with our species resorting to an immutable base nature, we are instead dealing with the terror inspired by specific corrupt institutions abusing their authority. This is why A Plague Tale comes to a head with the boss fight against Vitalis, the defeat of an unambiguous bad guy, whereas The Last of Us has Joel's rescue of Ellie from the Fireflies tainted by a lie. Barring perhaps David, The Last of Us is painted in shades of grey, and there are arguments to be had about the rights and wrongs of Joel's actions in St. Mary's Hospital, which we'll come on to. There is no credible case in favour of Grand Inquisitor Vitalis. All of this reflects a more positive perspective overall than The Last of Us, even amidst the bleakness. Where The Last of Us has moments such as Ellie cracking jokes as momentary breaks from the darkness, serving to repair Joel's humanity, it still ultimately ends on that beat of distrust and uncertainty, as Joel opts to lie to her about his choice in the hospital. A Plague Tale Innocence also uses the children's interactions to inject levity, but it has no Joel to soften up here. Everyone involved is part of the levity, and instead of restoring the hope of a hard man broken by the world, it demonstrates that these children will not be broken by the harshness of their reality. Even when they suffer loss and parting of ways, the game ends on the notes of Amicia and Hugo's laughter and playfulness. A Plague Tale is a story rooted in tragedy as much as The Last of Us, but its approach to that tragedy is built upon a greater degree of optimism, and this will be the key not only to how it can still shine a light in the darkness of the second game, but also in the contrast between Amicia and Joel, and Amicia and Ellie in Part 2, after each makes their choice. Plague Tale Requiem and The Last of Us Part 2 both begin with the characters having found what feels like peace, only for that peace to be ripped from them by the inciting incidents of their narratives. In both cases, the status quo is broken not by a new or unexpected happening, but by the consequences of what came before. Neither Amicia nor Ellie is embarking on a fresh adventure. This is the second half of a story that never quite concluded. Whereas Joel's decision at the end of the first game is the driving force of the events in The Last of Us Part 2, even after his death, in Requiem is the revival of the macula in Hugo's blood. The otherwise random occurrence of getting mistaken for thieves by angry farmers, threatening Amicia's safety, and so getting Hugo riled up enough to reconnect with his powers. The parallels between Ellie and Hugo as carriers of something which could save humanity here take different directions. Hugo's role as carrier of the macula is central to the plot of Requiem, affecting Hugo directly in respect of both his eventual fate and his mindset at various points, but also motivating Amicia, Arno, and Victor and guiding their respective character arcs. And for Amicia and Victor in particular, it takes on a mystical and religious relevance in the parallel between Amicia and Hugo and their predecessors Ilia and Basilius, and in the cult of the Child of the Embers. On the other hand, for Ellie it's no longer the immunity itself, but its role in potentially giving her life meaning amidst all the loss she has suffered that defines her character progression, causing her rift with Joel, and in turn seeing her chance to fully repair that rift stolen from her. It doesn't drive the arcs of other characters, however. It's a cause of momentary conflict with Dina, but is soon overtaken by the question of whether what Abby did gets to become more important than their future. For Abby, it doesn't actually matter, because what does is the loss of her father. He hardly reacts to Ellie's declaration that there's no cure because of her, and of her friends, only Nora comments on the immunity at all. Its main importance is in the decision it drove Joel to take at the end of the first game. This is down to the nature of their conditions. Ellie's immunity to the cordyceps affects her only in that it's potentially key to a cure, which is why the Fireflies wanted to operate on it. But beyond the relative safety if bitten again, assuming the infected don't kill her in the act, there's no day-to-day impact. Hugo, on the other hand, isn't just the focus of several powerful factions for who he is, but he has powers. Those powers don't just mean he can sick rats on people, but also that the voice of the macula talks to him and tries to influence him. It causes headaches, it overwhelms him to the point of passing out, and it fills the hole in him created by grief at his mother's death. Another key difference between the two is agency. Where Ellie is an adult and capable of making and following through her decisions even when her friends try to talk her around, Hugo is still a child. That means that others are constantly making decisions for him, some with good intentions, others malicious, but still it feeds into that sense of powerlessness and being overwhelmed that he feels through all of this. Ellie is driven by the feeling that her life lacks meaning, vengeance gripping her like an addiction because it gives her a catharsis, as damaging as it turns out to be. Hugo's life is drowning in meaning, and what others want to do with that meaning, giving him no chance to be his own person in his own way. Even when Amicia seeks out the previous carrier in search of a cure, it turns out only to foreshadow a fate he cannot avoid and must ultimately make peace with. Neither Amicia nor Ellie was left with any choice but to kill. But whilst initially shaken by the first time she shot a man to save Joel, the conflicting feelings of what she has done fall away with Joel's acceptance. He assures her that there was no choice, and he finally gives her a gun and accepts her help in getting past enemies. Killing is a fact of life in the post-apocalypse, and the only time we see it shake her again in the first game is in the aftermath of the encounter with David. But that isn't about having to kill so much as the trauma of learning men can do far darker things than simply try to murder you. For Amicia, once she is forced to kill again in Requiem, she is visibly shaken by it. It very quickly becomes apparent that this is down not to an aversion to killing, but an anger-driven lust for it. She and Lucas get captured because she loses control and stands her ground, screaming as she kills soldiers rather than fleeing. Arno is able to knock her down and nearly kill her, as again, the same rage overtakes her. Victor uses her rage against her, taunting her and toying with her shortly before her mother is murdered. Ellie's loss of control isn't presented through the act of killing so much as through continual pursuit of vengeance, even where it means abandoning her friends or putting them at risk. Where killing does factor into it is when she feels it necessary to be cruel. Her torture of Nora leaves her trembling and almost non-verbal, while she throws up in response to the realization that she has killed a pregnant woman. In both cases, she tries to do what she believes Joel would do in order to reach Abby, and her response in the aftermath is a stark reminder that she is not him. Because Ellie's goal is vengeance, whereas Amicia's is to protect her brother, we see the harm they cause to themselves manifest in different ways as well. Ellie's pursuit of her goal pushes away those who care about her, whereas Amicia's goal is to keep hold of those she loves, and frustration at the world being aligned against that aim drives her to self-sabotage through rash and hot-headed actions. That she recognises what she is doing to herself, even whilst unable to pull back, is reflected in her reaction to Hugo using his power. He fears for him, of course, the driving force of the story being her ultimately futile attempt to cure him so that they can both live out a normal life. But she also recognises her own rage manifesting in him, such as when he kills the slavers they encounter on their way to the castle where Aelia had been held, or later her desperate attempt to stop him doing the same at the castle. The siblings share each other's frustration at the notion of trying to do the right thing and failing, even when everyone they encounter seems to do whatever they want, no matter how morally dubious. But she also insists that the burden of deciding when killing is necessary should fall to her and that he shouldn't take it upon himself. Even as the darkness of the world is consuming her, she remains stubbornly adamant that she will protect him from it and they will both come out the other side. This too contrasts sharply with Ellie. It's the nature of the world around her and the people in it that frustrates Amicia's desire to win Hugo away to a normal life. Whilst Ellie and Dina appear to have that life, and yet Ellie still cannot escape the trauma and PTSD attacks, and so walks away because she believes that killing Abby is the only way to bring that to an end and find true peace. Trauma plays heavily into the stories of both A Plague Tale and The Last of Us. The loss of loved ones, inescapable violence, the mental burden that creates, and how it affects our ability to do what we perceive as necessary in those situations. The deeper that Ellie sinks into her pursuit of vengeance, the more inescapable the trauma appears and the more fleeting the moments of relief or even joy. Most explicitly, her PTSD being triggered by the fall of a shovel at the farm tells us just how deep what she has gone through has dug into her psyche. However, whilst Amicia's trauma is expressed viscerally, it's more frequently punctuated by levity. The narrative reflects her own efforts to put on a brave face for Hugo, as well as his childlike and fleeting understanding of what death really means. At the end, we see a physical representation of the guilt he has taken on board for the deaths he has caused, and at various moments before that, he rages against everything being his fault, or him always making things worse. Yet still, we get moments of joy, of play, and of new bonds of friendship being forged. Amicia is fighting to save what she still has, and Ellie to avenge what she has already lost, and their stories reflect that. It's ironic that, through the story, A Plague Tale offers far more hope than The Last of Us of an escape from the trauma and horror. Yet at the end, it turns out to be that very hope which Amicia must surrender in order to bring things to an end. The epilogue of the story therefore focuses on acceptance of when things are beyond our power and living with what has happened. The Last of Us Part 2 is more ambiguous about whether Ellie can find this acceptance, yet there's a note of hope there, with clues for us to infer that she may finally be able to allow Joel's spirit to rest and reclaim what she had with Dina. The through line of The Last of Us Part 2 is revenge. It drives Abby's actions at the start of the game, and in turn avenging what Abby did pushes Ellie first to Seattle and later Santa Barbara. Yet, for both Abby and Ellie, vengeance is little more than a MacGuffin. The journey they undertake, both physical and emotional, on the route to what they seek is far more important than whether they find it. As we see most explicitly in Abby's story, actually getting revenge at best changes nothing, and at worst causes active harm. Her nightmares about her father's death don't go away, but it does drive a wedge between her and her friends by showing them the darkness that she's capable of and haunting them with guilt, as well as causing their deaths by setting Ellie on the path she travels. Her arc then becomes about finding a way beyond the darkness, with the scales falling from her eyes regarding the ideology of the war the WLF fights, and Lev and Yara, who should be her enemies, giving her a path to family, love and hope. But the nature of revenge and violence more broadly means first she must overcome not only Ellie seeking payback for Joel, but also the WLF's retribution for turning against them. Ellie's quest for vengeance is still ongoing through the story, but we see how it negatively impacts upon her mental state, piling onto the existing trauma from Joel's death as she comes to terms with what she has done, but in turn the drive to keep pushing forward creating a schism between her and those she cares about. She abandons Jesse and their attempt to rescue Tommy because she sees a way to get to Abby's hideout, and her actions there lead Abby to her, killing Jesse and leaving Tommy half blind and limping. Even when it seems that this pulls her back from the brink and allows her to settle down and be happy with Dina, Tommy has now succumbed to a bitter, helpless anger which separates him from Maria. This drives him to berate Ellie for giving up and also provide a location for Abby, making the drive to once again hunt her down inescapable. Even with Dina's pleading, her ongoing PTSD symptoms make the choice for her as she surrenders the life she has made in order to go to Santa Barbara. In A Plague Tale: Requiem, Amicia seeks refuge from her violent world rather than revenge upon it. She and Arno become allies and eventually friends despite the violence he does to her and her killing his men, united by the common cause of getting away from those hunting them down. However, Arno betrays them in his quest for revenge against the Count of Provence, even planning to use Hugo's power to kill Victor. Amicia stops him, getting Arno jailed and winning the favour of the Count and his wife. Yet this doesn't stop Victor from later trying to murder her in service of the lie he has created about the Child of Embers. After she, Hugo and Lucas escape, the Countess having killed Beatrice, common cause once more drives Amicia and Arno together. He saves him from the noose, and he stands with her against Victor, who has been driven further to madness by the Countess's death, and seeks revenge as well as to capture Hugo for his own ends. In helping Amicia stop him so she can rescue Hugo, Arno eventually gets his revenge through Amicia's sling, but only at the cost of his own life. In A Plague Tale, just as in The Last of Us, vengeance is destructive and it comes at a high cost. For Arno, it does almost cost him friendship as it does to Ellie and Abby, but it also ultimately serves to reforge those friendships and give his life the most meaning at the point where he loses it. On the other hand, the fight to save Hugo rather than any notion of revenge is what so often leads Amicia astray and causes the schisms in her life. She abandons her mother and Lucas to seek out the island Hugo has dreamed of from fear that the Alchemist Order have ill intentions towards her brother. Whilst this turns out to be right, it also puts Hugo directly in the path of others who seek to misuse his power for their own ends. She then turns on Arno for his betrayal, but in doing so puts Hugo on Victor's radar. Seeking out the truth of the last carrier and protector's fate finally warns her of what she must do to bring Hugo to safety, but by then it's too late, and once Victor's soldiers finds her and brings her back to the castle, the course of fate is sealed. Even in escaping Victor, it's necessary to put Hugo in thrall to the Macula, and Victor's attack in revenge for this leads Hugo to believe Amicia is dead, sealing his final fate even before Amicia reaches the walls of Marseille. In both narratives, vengeance plays its part, but in different ways and with differing consequences. However, all of the characters in the two stories are caught up in the cycle of violence, a loop which tightens around them like a noose. For some, like Arno in A Plague Tale or Owen in The Last of Us, even when they actively try to leave it behind, the only escape comes in death. For others, such as our protagonists, they must make a choice and deal with the consequences that follow. Before we compare Amicia's choice at the end of A Plague Tale: Requiem with the choices made by Ellie and Abby in The Last of Us Part 2 and by Joel in The Last of Us Part 1, let's look at it in its own right. Throughout the game, Amicia's driving goal has been to keep Hugo alive and safe at all costs. His safety is what necessitates her killing others, from the first life she took with her sling right up to the Grand Inquisitor Vitalis. In Requiem, it inspires distrust in the Order of Alchemists who want to lock Hugo away. It separates her from her mother to pursue the idea of a cure. It pushes her deep into the ruins where the previous carrier and protector died. And finally, it sends her into the rat-infested destruction of Marseille. It drives the rage which sees her willing to stand alone and take on the world, unwilling to accept the injustice all around her. She cannot fathom why others would accept the world as it is, why they won't fight, kicking and screaming, to keep hope alive in the face of cruel men doing as they please in service of power. All of this makes Amicia, who's still only 16 years old, a force to be reckoned with when protecting Hugo. But it also makes her reckless, so that Arno and Victor can both easily poke through the holes in her armour to show the vulnerabilities beneath. Their actions and the path taken by fate chip away at her throughout the game, and in the face of the world's cruelty, she clings steadfastly to the hope that what is right can prevail, and she and Hugo can escape to a life of peace, even when Hugo is lost to the macula. It is Hugo himself who must reach out and implore her to accept the inevitability of what is coming. In the dust of Marseille, he shows her the futility of standing against the storm armed with only a sling. The only way to progress at this point in the game is to stop fighting and accept what is coming as he has done. This at last allows her to reunite with Lucas and reach Hugo, where there's only one thing to do. Here the game gives you a choice, but it's a Hobson's choice, an illusion. Whether Amicia looses a stone with her sling, or whether she falls to her knees and says she cannot do it, and Lucas takes up the crossbow to fire, the same thing happens. The screen cuts to black and Hugo dies. By contrast, the protagonists of The Last of Us have real choices with real diverging outcomes, even where they're made under duress, but we as the player do not get to make them. Like Amicia, Ellie's choice at the end of The Last of Us Part 2 is to stop fighting. The key difference is that Ellie hasn't been fighting to keep someone alive, but to kill in retribution for what she has lost, and where Amicia's choice to stop fighting results in Hugo's death, Ellie's results in Abby living. Both decisions allow the characters to pull away from a path that was consuming them, with ever-decreasing promise of what they lost being worth what they gained. Ellie's fight to avenge Joel had cost Jesse's life and turned Tommy into a shell of what he once was and a warning of what she might become, stripping her of the happiness that she had found with Dina and JJ. In exchange, any promise of peace or resolution from finally killing Abby rang hollow. When Ellie finds Abby, she's not the powerful foe who beat Joel to death with a golf club, but a starved and dehydrated figure already on the cusp of death after being strung up by the Rattlers. Throughout her journey, Ellie had repeatedly stated that she didn't want her foes to be killed by others, as it went against her sense of justice. But when she cut down Abby, she was herself badly wounded and in no shape to fight. Seeing this, after hesitating, Abby not only turns her back on Ellie in order to cut Lev down, but she also even points Ellie towards boats to escape from this place. Almost on autopilot, Ellie follows, struggling to even climb the short step away from the pillars. At that point, she appears to be resigned already to leaving Abby behind, walking to another boat and painfully taking her pack off as Abby puts Lev down. Where Amicia's resolve is steadfast right up until Hugo teaches her the lesson that not fighting is the only way forward, here Ellie has almost been on autopilot. The decision to go to Santa Barbara was driven not by conviction but by helplessness, feeling it was the only way to escape from the weight of her trauma. Well aware of the cost of her actions, she's pushed on because she cannot live with the feelings that remain. Even here, at the end, it's the sight of blood on her hand as a trigger for the PTSD of Joel's death that prevents her from simply sailing away. Faced with the unbeatable wave of rats that Hugo throws at her, Amicia screams her defiance of and rage at the world. Finally within reach of Abby, Ellie's voice is mournful as she announces that she cannot let her leave. Even as she forces Abby to fight her despite her reluctance, we can also see Ellie forcing herself into the fight and swallowing down the pain, fatigue and reason that might otherwise call her to sail away. Amicia's decision to kill Hugo, or to let Lucas do it, occurs in a moment of silent, haunting calm. There's no threat to her life now, only a clear path to her brother. All that stands between her and him is the weight of what she must do. Ellie and Abby, meanwhile, are caught in a brutal and exhausting fight that surely must end in the death of one or the other. There's nobody around and nothing to stop her from finally accomplishing her mission and ending Abby's life. As Abby drowns, she thinks back to her last interaction with Joel, of all that was left unresolved between them, even with the promise of reconciliation at the very end. There's no monologue to tell us explicitly and unequivocally why she pulled back, but we know that in the final conversation she remembers, he had said she would try to forgive Joel, and Joel reaffirmed that, given the choice again, he would always make the same choice to save her. Perhaps he finally did, by her pulling back from completely losing herself to a quest that could never bring her peace. Both Ellie and Amicia grieve their decisions, Amicia mourning the death of her brother, and Ellie weeping with the loss of anything to carry her forward to stop her succumbing to exhaustion and isolation. In the epilogue, both find a reason to keep going. We don't know Ellie's, whether she is reconciled with Dina and begun to heal, or whether she's moving on with no clear direction, but either way she is moving on. Amicia is seeking signs of the next carrier of the macula to help their protector find the right path. Both carry the scars of their journeys and decisions. What comes next for them, unknown. Abby's truce in The Last of Us Part 2 comes on Seattle Day 3, where she is trying to guide Lev and Yara to safety from the conflict between the WLF and the Seraphites. Yara is shot by a wolf, and after attacking him to protect Lev, she finds herself face to face with the leader of her former faction, Isaac. He offers her a way out of this safely, but only if she steps aside so that he can kill Lev. Abby and Amicia here both face a conflict between their personal loyalties and the right thing. Abby has been part of the WLF since they took her and her friends in after the death of her father and the dissolution of the Fireflies. She has been an active and enthusiastic participant in their war against the Seraphites, even an apologist for the WLF's crimes in that conflict because of her ideological affinity. Until now, she hasn't had to account for the shift in her position. She's been in denial about the implications of her desertion from the WLF, justifying it on the basis of the necessity of ensuring Owen's safety. Rescuing 2 Seraphites on the way to him was simply a matter of repaying them for saving her life, and after all, they were also being targeted by the Seraphites for the crime of apostasy. She was still fighting the same enemy and had the same friends. But her love for Lev and Yara did challenge her preconceptions. Being asked about the torture committed by the WLF made her uncomfortable. She was able to recognise the unreasonableness of Isaac's position when talking to Yara, and with Lev she learned to stop calling Seraphites scars for the marks on their faces. Though she wasn't at risk of siding with the Seraphites, she was no longer loyal to the WLF, though until this confrontation, that wasn't something that had manifested consciously. This is different to the loyalty Amicia had to Hugo, of course. Amicia and Hugo's relationship is closer to Abby and Lev's than Abby and the WLF's, but still there was a divide between where she felt she had loyalties and what was necessary to do the right thing. Amicia had to actively take the life of Hugo, whereas all Abby had to do was get away and keep Lev alive, the death of Isaac being incidental to that. Hugo was also the main voice arguing for her to take the decision she did, whilst Isaac and the WLF refused to hear her pleading and instead forced her hand whilst trying to stop her from doing what she did. The other key difference is that Amicia's decision marked the end of the story. Hugo's death stopped the plague and meant that, despite the loss of her brother, she was finally safe. Abby standing between Lev and Isaac meant that the pair barely escaped with their lives, and they were then actively targeted by the WLF seeking vengeance. Even when engaging with one another, both the WLF and Seraphites would actively call out when they spotted the pair and focus on the only thing worse than the official enemy, the betrayers. The most direct parallel to Amicia's decision at the end of A Plague Tale: Requiem is of course Joel's at the end of The Last of Us Part 1. Both Amicia and Joel had their roles thrust upon them unwillingly. Joel had shut himself off from the world, hardened by the loss of Sarah and what the world became after Outbreak Day. Amicia hardly knew her brother, sheltered from the world as he was under the care of their mother. But circumstances conspired to push the two together. Marlene had nobody else to turn to with the Fireflies losing bloodly to the military, and Joel and Tess having killed Robert. The death of the Fireflies at the capital and Tess having been bitten then meant that Joel and Ellie only had each other. The arrival of the Inquisition forced Beatrice to help her children flee and to stay behind and face capture in order to ensure their escape. This left Amicia responsible for Hugo's fate. The two journeys do diverge along the way. Amicia over her journey builds up allies in Lucas, Melly and Arthur, and Roderick in the first game, and then Arno and Sophia in the second. But Joel's alliance with Bill is volatile and acrimonious, with Joel able to get what he is owed but not able to rely on him past that point. Although he grows to trust Sam and Henry, their shared goal is brutally cut short when Sam is infected and Henry commits suicide with the guilt of having to kill him. Tommy is the closest Joel has to a long-term ally, though their relationship is complicated and Joel has to leave him behind when he finally gets past denial about his attachment to Ellie, so the pair face the final leg of their journey alone. It's also worth noting that whilst there are forces that wish to use Hugo for their own ends, first the Inquisition and Vitalis, then Arno, and finally Victor, this is not directly analogous to the Fireflies. Whilst the Inquisition views itself as saving humanity through its actions, the way they seek to use Hugo is in service of their own power and subduing those who cross them. There are discussions to be had about the Firefly's methods and goals, but what they actually sought from Ellie, a vaccine for the cordyceps brain infection, is hard to argue against. It's only when in doing so they would have to take Ellie's life that things become problematic. As such, the organisation closest to the Fireflies in terms of what it seeks to do is the Order of Alchemists. They too chose the fate of the world over the fate of a child, albeit in isolating him as they had the previous carrier to prevent a plague rather than using him to cure a plague. But whilst Joel's choice comes down to the Fireflies actively carrying out their intent and him either allowing or stopping it, the Order has no direct hand in Hugo's fate in a plague tale, and instead Amicia has their example hanging over her as what she seeks to avoid. This is how Joel and Amicia's actions are the inverse of one another. Joel initially seeks to bring Ellie to the Fireflies for a cure, unaware of the fatal consequences, whilst Amicia distrusts the Order and subsequently learns of the previous carrier's fate, so determining to stop that happening to Hugo. Joel's initial skepticism of Ellie's immunity is slowly moved by Tessa's belief and his relationship with Ellie, and the two come to share the goal of getting a vaccine until the consequences become clear. Amicia and Hugo start off both seeking a cure for Hugo, but the revelations of what happened in the past see Hugo starting to feel that his life only makes things worse, while Amicia clings fervently to hope that he can be saved until forced to reluctantly concede otherwise in the final act. In The Last of Us Part 2, it's confirmed that Ellie was willing to die for a vaccine and felt robbed of this by Joel's actions. But in Part 1, she is stripped of agency on account of being found unconscious and Abby's father arguing for surgery. Joel's opposition to this is met with the threat of violence, meaning that although he went against Ellie's wishes, it was the Fireflies who decided not to give her a choice in the matter and forced Joel's hand. All of the events in the final chapter happen to Ellie, but she gets no say in any of it at that point. Hugo, however, spends the majority of both the Playtale games with others continually telling him what is best for him and deciding for him, whilst in the final chapter he gets to drive the final decision that results in his death. Whilst he lost control due to believing Amicia was dead and gave himself over to the macula, he also directed Amicia and Lucas to him and accepted his fate before they, or at least his sister, did. It's also worth noting that in killing Hugo, Amicia unambiguously saved the world by ending the plague and stopping the rats being unleashed upon the whole world. Even with a vaccine which could stop future infections, which is debatable in and of itself, the masses of infected already out there in the world of The Last of Us would remain, and the brutal, fractured nature of humanity could only really be undone through a massive effort, likely including war, as many would no doubt see a vaccine as a threat to their power, given the explicit goals of the Fireflies. It's therefore far easier to posit that Amicia saved the world by killing Hugo than that Joel doomed the world by saving Ellie. Despite how hard her choice was, and the tragedy of the ending in Hugo's life overall, the result was a lot clearer cut than in The Last of Us. This reflects the type of stories that the two games are striving to tell. Both depict violence, death, and man's inhumanity to man in ways that echo each other, the tone and imagery of the two series paralleling one another just as the themes of their narratives do. But whilst The Last of Us is a character story of humanity, rooted in the relationship between individuals and a relentlessly gritty realism, A Plague Tale is closer to a dark fairy tale. Not only because of the supernatural nature of the story and the period setting, both of which strike a different note to a fungal virus in a near-future post-apocalypse, but also in its choice of characters and delivery. Amicia and Hugo are children, as are most of their companions. Their antagonists are malevolent adults, and the adults on their side are colourful and larger-than-life outsiders. The first game gives us 5 teenagers with complementary abilities working together to stop the evil Inquisition. Sophia being a smuggler and Arno being the leader of an armed rebellion, essentially placing them in the fantasy roles of pirate and knight. As head of the Inquisition, Vitalis serves as the wolf or devil figure in Innocence, whilst Victor is a literal evil lord standing for the cruel royalty that populates so many fairy tales. The strength of A Plague Tale is in drawing upon these motifs in a way that still feels grounded and allows for the telling of a strong, character-driven story with so much depth. It also helps the games to establish their own identity, while still using ideas that have deep roots in our culture and mythology as touchstones. The Last of Us also draws upon familiar themes, a broken man learning to love again through a young ward, and the psychological and emotional toll of seeking revenge have been explored in many stories. But in the case of both franchises, it's how these stories are told that matters. That the characters experiencing the events feel real, fleshed out, and worth our time to invest in. This is what will keep their stories relevant and invest us in discussing and dissecting them, as I've done here. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content, like the video that's just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. Check out the links in the description to join my Patreon for as little as £1 per month, or donate to my GoFundMe and get your name in the credits of my videos, like those rolling up now, who I want to thank for supporting me and my content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.